Should I tell him about Johnny T-shirt?
Yeah.
Let's go.
Make sure
Welcome
you
into
check.
the Inside Carolina Game Plan Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Ashley. We're sponsored by Johnny T-shirt. We're sponsored by Congruity. And that is Greg Barnes and Jason Staples. The show's entitled Last Ride. It's the last regular season game for North Carolina in 2024. Last home game for Mack Brown in his North Carolina career. Last game plan of a regular season game. And hopefully last ice cream cone for Jason Staples during the hour. Greg, I'm going to come to you first because, Jason, I hadn't had anything to eat. The crash party has finally arrived. But, Greg, we need to talk a little bit about some actual football that'll happen on Saturday night or Saturday afternoon, Saturday night. But as we were talking off the air, this time of year, I mean, it's always hectic. And then you throw all of this stuff into it. I don't know if we can imagine what it's like to be a college player, what it's like to be a college administrator, heck, what it's like to be somebody that covers college sports. We probably can answer that question. But your take on everything over the last few days, Greg?
Yeah, and I think you got to give Buck Sanders and Ben Sherman just a ton of credit for what they've done with Inside Carolina. Buck has been on some of these podcasts, and he's posted his columns on the board, so he's had some visibility. But Ben especially, he probably works more than any of us, and he's just completely behind the scenes. So just kudos to those guys for what they've built and what they do. But with the basketball team out in Maui, kind of worst case scenario is that you have a job change in football before the end of the season. And that's precisely, what we had. And, it's just Tommy, you did a phenomenal job yesterday with all the podcasts dating back to the night before, which technically was, I know, Tuesday, but that was quite the 24 hours that you had. It's a lot. It's kind of nonstop. And I think what people may not realize is the most difficult time of year, and I'll speak from my perspective, on the beat was really November and early December when you had the overlap with the sports. And then March, because March is insane if the team's any good, the basketball team's any good, and they're in the NCAA tournament. I think 2022, I was on the road 25 days out of 30 days, I guess, in March. How many days in March? 30? 31?
31.
So a lot of days there where you're just slam packed and you're busy pretty much nonstop. And then you add in a coaching change and it's like difficult to breathe. But the interesting thing is we get into this because we enjoy the chase, and it's an adrenaline rush. And I'm sure you felt that yesterday, Tommy, that it's exciting. And even though we're covering it, we're kind of viewing it both through the lens of media, but also just sports fans in general. And there's just a lot going on behind the scenes. You've got people contacting you, whether that's, powers that be, whether that's, players, parents, coaching staff. You just get all kinds of interactions, and you're trying to kind of build a story with everybody's input to make sure you have the right information to share to the public. And it's exhausting, but it's also exhilarating. And I think fans don't really understand that because we try to keep that kind of behind the scenes. But I think you got a really good taste of that yesterday, Tommy.
Yeah, I think what the best way I can describe it for folks is everybody's seen the duck on top of the water, a graceful, beautiful animal. But if you look underneath the water, those feet are going like crazy to propel it. And that's kind of like it was. To your point, Greg, wrap up post-game show at like 4 in the morning, 3 or 4 in the morning on Tuesday morning, Monday night, Tuesday morning. Have to folks have lives to get stuff done, especially with the holiday coming and then news breaks and all. So, but yeah, it's a labor of love for sure. And I agree with you. Shout out to Buck and Ben for, I mean, I don't know when Ben sleeps. I know that I passed out back here in bonus room earlier about 5 o'clock.
I don't think
And
Ben does sleep.
I have no evidence that that man sleeps, but he's always, and he's probably listening right now. So Ben, get some sleep at some point, but it's just an incredible team that puts together. And then, at some point we have to beam our satellites up to 30,000 feet and get people on air when they decide they're going to fly across country in the middle of all this. And Jason Staples, I can say, well, I don't. Are we in the Mile High Club now to be able to talk to you? To be able to get you on a podcast from you certainly gave us the 30,000-foot view of all this, but getting here on the last couple of days for you trying to do it's not Sunday's show. I can get away with that on Wednesday, but Jason, your take here on the last few days.
Well, first of all, I echo everything that was just said, and the amount of work that I know Ben puts in that nobody knows about is crazy. Just the amount of direction. I mean, we have a big staff, and to make sure that all the pieces run smoothly and everything is scheduled correctly. I mean, our mantra at I'm thinking NC State game. Our mantra at Inside Carolina has long been there is no off season, and that's been a way of life for a whole lot of folks, starting with Ben and Buck down. But yeah, that's just echoing all that. But the other thing that I didn't say and I should have said in the roundtable is one guy that I would call and make say no is Matt Campbell at Iowa State. And he might actually be my first call. Because you talk about a guy that has done more with less and has managed to make a team that's a consistent conference contender out of a team. I mean, look up Iowa State and number of 10-win seasons in program history and when they came. It's short, and pretty much all of them come under Matt Campbell. So I would call Matt Campbell and make him say no before I moved on to anybody else.
Does he qualify as a Midwest guy, though? I mean, I know he's from Ohio, but
he is a Midwest guy. There's no doubt about that. So full disclosure, I know Matt. And there has been some back and forth over the years. So if nothing else, I'd be thrilled to have him in Chapel Hill for that reason.
Yeah.
But that also means that I know, like, I've had some sense of how good he is for a long time. So I do think he's a Midwest guy. And that's part of why he's stayed in Ames as long as he had. I think if that Ohio State job came open, he'd probably take that Ohio State job.
Mm-hmm.
But absent that, I mean, I would try to sell him on, look, North Carolina's not Mississippi. North Carolina's not Florida. North Carolina can be as Midwest as you would like it to be, Coach. And Chapel Hill's a really good place to live and have children and all of that. Because, I mean, the living environment and all that matters to him, but he would be one of those guys that, and I see Gilbert is in the chat saying Iowa State right now has a chance to play for the Big 10 or Big 12 title. Their last conference title was in 1912. Now, in fairness, the Big 12 is now a group of 5 or group of 6 conference, so it's a little bit different because there is no Texas, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, although A&M's kind of a tier below, or at least traditionally was. So it's a little bit different conference in that respect, but no Nebraska. But still, that he would be one guy that I would make say no.
It's interesting, and Greg, I do want to try to talk football, but uh, what I hear from people nonstop. All right, you got the hardcore people that are on inside Carolina, the fans that keep up with everything. Then you've got the group, the everyday fan, we'll call them that. Why is this happening? Why are they getting rid of Mack Brown? Da, 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 da. And then you've got the other people that are like, what are they serving? That they serve merits at the stadium. You know what I mean? Those different type things. But timeline wise, Greg, and we talked about this on the roundtable a little bit, and I mentioned this because somebody on the message board said we said recruiting doesn't matter. But timeline is so sped up, and yes, you can rebuild your roster just like that these days. But how pressing is it, Greg, to get something done ASAP? And you balance that versus how pressing it is to get it right. I think that is a big challenge.
Yeah, and let me address the recruiting question. Jason had a good reply on the message board about that. I probably was the one who said it, and really, what we're talking about is, for a long time, Mack Brown was phenomenal, and he was head above his peers because he could go into a high school kid's kitchen and convince that kid and his players that North Carolina or Texas was the spot for him. And we have progressed so much in terms of the sport that now you have the portal, now you have NIL. It's not so much about the ability to go and sit and talk to high school parents and build that relationship over a period of years, which Mack was fantastic with. It's about making quick connections. It's about rapid evaluation. It's about having the staff in place to figure out who the best players are, who's attainable, where you should direct any NIL money that you have in getting the deal done and signing the contract. And there's a lot of different pieces involved. And if you want to say, oh, that's recruiting, fine. But it's not traditional recruiting in the way that we grew up knowing it. And that's kind of the point I was making, that there's a lot more into this. And you've got guys on staff who do the recruiting coordinating. And if you Pat Sudis, I think it's a great example, who's phenomenal at what he does, but he's really the general manager for the football program. And he kind of does a lot with his staff in terms of saying, okay, well, these are the portal options that are worth the coaching staff looking at. These are the kids in the high school ranks that are worth the staff looking at and deciding what their hierarchy are. And it used to not be that way. And so it's just kind of a different aspect. You still have to get the players, as Jason pointed out in that thread. I mean, that ultimately decides how good you're going to be. It's just completely different now than what it was. I think that's kind of the main takeaway. But in terms of timeline, it's a very good question, Tommy. And I don't know that I have a consistent answer from people that we've spoken with. Clearly, everybody knows that December 4th is the early National Signing Day. Everybody knows that December 9th is when the portal opens. Everybody also knows that once that decision is made that Mack is no longer the coach at North Carolina, the portal opens for 30 days for North Carolina players. So players can be jumping into the portal really as soon as they want to. And so that's something to watch as well. And as Don Callahan did a good job of pointing out in our roundtable, you've got to be cognizant of that. Because if there's a little bit of a lag between when Mack leaves and the new coach comes in, well, that's a window where players can leave because they don't know exactly what's going on. And that's a legitimate concern. But I think the focus is you've got to make sure you have the right guy. And fans don't want to hear this. But if that means, you may suffer a little bit next year because you're having to take the necessary steps to get the guy that you think is going to be the one years down the road, then that's a price that you're willing to pay. Now, in the ideal situation, the guy that you want is ready to jump on Sunday and he signs and you're good to go. I think that's kind of the wishful dreaming a little bit, that everything works that way, but there are a bunch of different pieces involved. And, if the guy that you want's in the college football playoff and he's like, you know what, I need to wait. Well, that's okay. And it may be a situation that they go ahead and name their next coach, but yet that guy is going to continue to coach for a few more weeks. How does that affect things? Larry Fedora did that. He coached the bowl game for Southern Miss when he was named. And that caused a little bit of problems with the recruiting aspect of things. But of course, that was back when you had the normal signing day, first Wednesday of February. So there's a lot of different pieces in play, but probably the consistent thing that I've heard is getting the right guy is the primary objective. And if you have to take a hit a little bit with recruiting in this cycle, so be it.
Jason, your thoughts on that before we turn to Carolina and NC State? Muted, second time in a week.
Brutal, just brutal.
We got a $5 jar.
Yeah,
Christmas time in a house.
Yeah, I'll have to figure out a way to save up $5. So yeah, I agree with that, and I agree that the emphasis, you have to treat this as a long-term decision, a 5-year decision rather than a 1-year decision. And if that does cost you a little bit on the front end, then you take that. Now, the difficulty of that is that the new coach smell is a thing in terms of attracting talent, in terms of setting vision and all of that. So you've got to make sure that the new coach is able to maximize his ability to use that new coach smell, right? If you hire a guy after the portal has closed and there's no recruits left to go after in this cycle, and then you have a really rough first year because you just don't have any talent on your roster, that's going to be a problem because the new coach smell will wear off. So that's the other thing that you have to keep in mind in this whole process is you're hiring for the long term, but you do have to consider that you can't sacrifice everything in year one in order to get the right guy because then he's not going to be the right guy. So yeah, I do think one thing you want to make sure you hire, you've got to hire somebody who's, I think you need to emphasize somebody who's on the young side. And, I think, 45, maybe 50 years old would be my cutoff. And you've got to have somebody who's well respected. One thing I would do, I would probably hire Dave Bartu in the analytics firm that has, just to take a look at all of their metrics. I've seen some of that in the past, and their metrics in terms of what coaches have done in terms of, doing more with less, recruiting. It's one thing. So I see a lot of people talking about Glenn Schumann, for example, as a great recruiter in all of this. Well, he's been at Alabama and Georgia. I mean, how much do we know that Glenn Schumann would be a great recruiter when he's not there at Alabama and Georgia? Right? There's a difference there. One of the things that I like about what Bartu has done is, and if Carolina doesn't want to pay for this, then you try to find a way to do it in-house. You compare how a coach has recruited and using a variety of different metrics against how the program that he's at or the programs that he's been at have recruited historically without him. So if you are, let's say, Kalen DeBoer, and you average a top 6 recruiting class at Alabama the next few years, does that mean you're a great recruiter, or does that mean that, you're pretty average, but you're at Alabama? Because, Alabama's been a top 5 recruiter, top 3 recruiter, top 2 recruiter. And that's something that you have to assess is, okay, relative to the other programs that you're around, where do you fit? What's your performance level? There are certain group of 5 programs, certain programs where it's easier to win than it is at other programs. And if you win at some of those group of 5 programs, it doesn't say as much as if you win at certain other group of 5 programs. And you have to consider all of those things. Do you have a guy who took over a program that was already humming and then just kept it rolling? Or do you have a guy that's turned around multiple programs? These are things you have to assess when you're making those calls.
It is not just as simple as it sounds. And Greg, let me ask you about another concern that people have. And Greg, are you with me, or are you getting the duct tape fixed on that computer?
I am with you wholeheartedly.
Carolina hires somebody. They have a couple good seasons, and they go off to a newfound adventure at a bigger school or for more money. That to me, that just means Carolina had a couple good seasons, couple 2 or 3 good seasons, and that's not a bad thing. Your thoughts?
I absolutely agree. And look, we have to understand that the playing field has shifted. It's changed. It is no longer the Power 5. It's the Power 2. And if you have a good coach and he's young and he's exciting and maybe he has ties to the Southeast or the Midwest, well, maybe an SEC school or a Big Ten school is going to come calling. And that's okay, as you say, Tommy, because that means that you've had success. But what happens is that coach is going to be entrenched in what you're doing. So let's say it's 3 years down the road. Well, if he's young, he's probably got a family. And so the family has ties there. He's established relationships. He's got the recruiting network set up. So there are a bunch of ties already in place when maybe that next job comes along. Now, if it's a dream job or it's a next level up job, if it's Notre Dame calling or Ohio State, well, it's a different conversation. But if it's a position where it's going to be a little bit more than a lateral move, but it's really a money conversation, well, then maybe you can have that conversation. It's like, you know what? You've had success. We are committed to football now. They've been saying that for the past year or so. Then you can have that negotiation.
A little late on that, guys.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But now
that's a different show.
It's a different show, right? That's off season. That's not now, Jason. But that's the conversation at that point in time. And you do everything you can if you think that person is the coach of the future to get them to stay, because you're at a position where you can make that argument and you can make a case. And really, the last time that that's happened at North Carolina was when Mack was here last time. And that, regardless of what you think about how Mack Brown handled that situation, everybody that we've talked to say that Dick Bedore botched the negotiations on the Carolina side. That doesn't mean that Mack would have stayed if everything would have gone right, but it was not handled the way that it needed to be handled. And I think that has changed. And so to answer your question, you want other teams coming for your coach because that means you've had success. And then it's up to Carolina to say, you know what, these are the reasons for you to stay. We're committed to making North Carolina that next level program. And maybe a couple of years down the road, we're having the conversation about not only do we want you to stay, but we're going to the SEC in a couple of years anyway. So just hold tight and you're going to be in good shape.
Look at what Indiana did. They paid their guy. I mean, he could flame out and he's going to get a ton of money. But anyway, last question. And I just want a fairly as simple answer as possible, which I know this is not a simple question. Greg, does Carolina making this move, does Bubba Cunningham saying, yeah, I understand what you want to do, but that's not what we're going to do, does that signify, to our point just a second ago, that Carolina is in fact all in on the football side?
I don't think there's any question that Carolina understands the importance of football. Everybody that we've talked to over the past year or so has been adamant on that fact, whether that's Board of Trustees Chairman John Pryor, whether that's former Chancellor Kevin Guskowitz. Bubba Cunningham has spoke to that regard. A lot of boosters and people around the program have spoken about that. I think everybody is on board with understanding that football is king now. And there's really not much to debate that. I mean, if you get to the national championship game this year, your team, not the league, your team, your program, your school can get $20 million out of that. And that's on top of the base payout per school for the Power Four, which is about 13 to 14 million. The ACC last year, as a whole, brought in $34 million in the NCAA tournament. And that's split across everybody and is paid out over 6 years. So you're talking about 240 million for football this year compared to 34 million in the NCAA tournament last year. I mean, that is a massive, massive differential.
It's like an 8-fold differential. I mean, that eventually when you start multiplying by 8, and eventually you start talking real money.
Yeah, it's not a conversation. And
Jason Staples money.
That's right. I don't think people
from your
in
lips to
charge
God's ears
at North Carolina are really debating that anymore. And so, yes, I think North Carolina as a whole is now embracing that. And to your point, I think the fact that they were willing to fire Mack Brown after winning 9 and then 8 and then maybe 7 or 8 this year speaks to that fact.
Football is king. Long live the king. It's a new world. We'll see. But a lot going on, a ton going on. Of course, Inside Carolina will be there. I'm going to talk about Johnny T-Shirt, and then we're going to talk about North Carolina State, North Carolina. Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-shirt.com. Sponsors, look, it's Christmas time. Black Friday is in 30 hours. Johnny T-Shirt's got you covered. What I would do is go see them on Franklin Street and visit them in person because they're awesome and wonderful to deal with. But if you can't, go to JohnnyT-shirt.com. Get all your swag, everything you need, shirts, hats, jerseys. You want to support Carolina? Go to Johnny T-Shirt, support them. Go to see Carolina play NC State on Saturday at 3:30 in Kenan Stadium. National guys will pay the bills. We'll come right back. It's the game plan. Okay, Jason, it's the game plan, and I'm remembering back to sitting in Carter Finley Stadium or whatever the heck they're going to name it now last year, and I saw a team in red playing against a bunch of guys on roller skates. How does that change this year, just off the top? What does North Carolina have to do to match up with an NC State team that I think, especially now, is going to come in even more wanting blood? You always say it's a trench game. How's Carolina fare against NC State of what you watch now for 11 games this season?
Yeah, State has not been an especially good rushing offense this season. So just taking a look at the last few games, and hang on, I'm pulling it up here. I was looking at this stuff a little earlier. Taking a look at the last few games, they've not been overwhelming on the ground, and a little bit. You have to think about it a little bit differently because they've been sort of two teams. They had the Grayson Lambert team, or Grayson McCall. Grayson Lambert is a different individual altogether. Grayson McCall team, and now they've moved in a different direction with the freshman, with CJ Bailey, who's now firmly entrenched after McCall's career ended. And they've been up and down as a rushing team. So you think about this, like Cal held them to 0.97 yards per carry on 30 carries.
Cal.
Now, Cal's got a pretty good defensive line, don't get me wrong. Duke held them to 2.9 yards per carry on 29 carries. But then Georgia Tech, they ran for 253 yards on 29 carries for 8.72 per carry. Which team are you going to get? I have my guess of which team's going to show up in a rivalry game against North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
But they are a team that has struggled to run the football for much of the year. And really, they've only run the football well against, ACC or above level competition in 2 games this year. And that's the Stanford game and the Georgia Tech game. And in that Georgia Tech game, by the way, the primary threat, the primary problem, rushing wise, was at the quarterback position, which is, I'm sure, music to the ears of every North Carolina fan. That C.J. Bailey torched Georgia Tech with his legs. 9 carries for 83 yards, 9.22 yards per carry. So that's something that Carolina's going to have to worry about in this game, is a quarterback who can break things down with his legs. Most of those, if not all of those, were scrambles, so not designed runs, but stuff where he broke things down. And he's a tall guy. He's 6'6". Doesn't look real fast, but he's one of those long striders and just runs and finds space, and all of a sudden you got a first down. So that's the first thing you have to worry about, is you're playing a team that's got a quarterback that can move, that in 2 of the last 3 games has finally broken through a little bit on the ground. But the thing that you're comfortable with, or the thing you're happy about, is that they've struggled to run the football basically in every other game. So which team of states shows up is part of the question. And then the next thing is how you match up with that mobile quarterback.
Greg, when you look at it, states had the ability to get their guy, like especially last year, Concepcion, who hasn't done a ton this year, but the guy was everywhere last year, and they've had the ability to do that. You've got Hollywood Smothers, you've got Raphael, you've got these guys. They've got the ability to run it in multiple ways, and we've seen North Carolina have success in stopping the run game. And to Jason's point, which Carolina defense shows up? I mean, your thoughts there, Greg, because if Team A shows up, I like Carolina's chances. If Team B shows up, yeah.
So let me tell you a story. The last time I was in Hawaii for the Maui Invitational was 2016. I covered the 2020 Maui Invitational, and it snowed on me as I walked to the arena in Asheville. So that's a good COVID story. But in 2016, my family was out there, and we woke up early on Saturday morning because of the time difference and watched the NC State Carolina game. And that was 2016, a long time ago. But some friends and colleagues of mine that cover NC State going into that game said, Doran's done. He just has not done enough in terms of wins and losses, because wins have been kind of empty. A lot of bad teams. He's kind of stacked up the victories. He hasn't done well in ACC play. He's out the door as soon as the season's over. Carolina had a pretty good team that year, although that was the Mitch Trubisky team where they kind of struggled at Duke and sent them on a spiral. Well, NC State jumped out to a 21-0 lead in that game. And Carolina came back, and I guess maybe Quinshot had an opportunity to catch a pass late. And regardless, NC State won 28-21. And it saved Doran's job. And here we are again 8 years later, and I don't know if Doran necessarily has to win this game to keep his job, because he's had a couple good years prior to this year. But there is a lot of frustration that NC State spent the amount of money they did in NIL this offseason, and even when McCall was healthy, they were not a legitimate top 25 program. Add to that the fact that NC State is 5-6. And if they want to get back to the postseason, they have to win this game. Now, before the happenings of Monday, when Mack Brown was fired, I would have given the edge to NC State, because they had a lot to play for, and Carolina really didn't, considering they were already bowl eligible. NC State will come ready to play. Doran will have them ready to play. And as we saw against JMU, as we saw against Boston College last week, and as we've seen too many times over the past 10 to 15 years, there are games when Carolina is not tough enough and they are not physical enough, and they're not strong enough along the line of scrimmage. So the question is, now that the team knows Mack Brown is out, and this is likely his last game as head coach at North Carolina, do they rally to the cause? And I think that's the conversation for this game. We can talk about all the specifics and rushing yards and quarterbacks and all these kind of things. Which team wants it more? Which team is fueled by their emotion more on Saturday? Whichever team is will win. Because we can talk about the dynamics of, State struggled here, they're good here. Carolina struggled here, they're good here. At the end of the day, it's going to be who wants it more.
Jason, how do you define that? And Greg's right, and we don't even need to go into it all, because we've done this podcast before where we've said, X, Y, and Z is going to happen, and this is what needs to happen. And to Greg's point, one team, Carolina, in Mack's first 2 years in 2.0, came out and just beat the hell out of them, and then we've seen it the other way around. So how much does, somebody in the chat, Chip in the chat says, what's the morale of the team and all that? How much of that stuff matters, Jason, going into a game? We know the Customato quote. But for a Carolina team that needs to finally stand up and say, we're the bully of the block, versus an NC State team that has shown that they can be the bully of the block. Do X's and O's and all that stuff matter in a game against two mid teams? That's a young.
They always
person
matter
quote too.
They always matter. But yeah, I mean, you ask, what's the impact of these sorts of things in this kind of game, the impact of the emotional factors and all that. And I think it's enormous. I think as much as anything, though, it's the impact of that during the week while you're preparing. What kind of week do you have preparing? Are guys paying attention? Are they invested? Are they bought in? Or are they checked out? What you see on Saturdays is the culmination of all that preparation leading into the game. And, for all that one of the things that I hear fans talk about all the time is, he's probably, he might be a gamer. He's just a gamer. I don't think people realize how rare gamers are. Like guys who are way better in games than they are in practice. If anything, it usually swings the other way. A guy's going to be better in practice than he is in games. And, maybe a gamer is just somebody who isn't that much worse in the game than he is in practice, as opposed to, a guy who's legitimately better in games than in practice. But, and actually I could give you, countless examples from basketball. I mean, Greg, you've seen NBA players shoot in a gym. It's different.
They don't miss.
They never miss. They just never miss. I mean, what was it? Steph Curry not long ago hit 73 in a row from 3-point line in practice. He was just, in a shoot around, like 93 of 100 from three. He's not doing that in games, but it does make sense of why in games when they are open, those guys tend to hit it. But then, you watch pro golfers in practice rounds or on the range or, on a monitor, these sorts of things. And those guys don't miss. It's unreal, the control of the golf ball they have. And then you get into tournament conditions, and as well as anybody, tournament golf is very different from, going out there hacking around with your buddies. You can be a whole lot better hacking around with your buddies than you can in a tournament. So I say all this to say that so much depends on preparation, because what you have to do is you have to be that much better against yourself in practice. You have to be that much better in your preparation to actually be able to perform well in the game. And so much of the emotional state of a team gets into the question of how well they prepare. How many mistakes are they tolerating with themselves? What level of intensity and focus are they having as they learn this? And they say, okay, when I see this is how I'm going to respond. And then when you get into the game, you respond that quickly because you've repped it right and with intensity during the week. So yeah, it matters a lot. problem is we have no idea how that's actually going to work. Are these guys going to rally around Mack and want to send him out that way, or do they check out? Are they already how much tampering happens at this point in college football? Are they already looking for an escape pod? How many of these players are looking around, reaching, for their parachute as, all right, well, I got to figure out where I'm going to be next year. How many of these guys are starting to listen to that and focusing on that this week, as opposed to circling the wagons and doubling down to send a beloved head coach out in the regular season with a win against an arch rival? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows outside that locker room, and I bet you that there's some of each on this roster. The question is how much of each. We don't know, and it does matter.
I think a great point. You make a great point there, and I was going to come back with the question. We talk about checking out and all that, but this is also an audition, right, for players. Because you don't want to crap the bed and show how bad you can be when you might be looking for those fish hooks in the water, that are out there for you, Greg. That side of it. It seemed, we can talk about rallying around a coach, going out, this and that. But also, guys have to show up and play if they want to have an opportunity. Roster spots aren't guaranteed anymore. I guess Carolina's would be, but not at other schools, right, Greg?
Yeah. And look, that's the byproduct of how this all went down, which I don't think it went down probably the way anybody liked for it to. The ideal situation that you can have here is that Mack Brown agrees to step down. You have your celebration after the season, sing Kumbaya and move on. And even though there may be some hard feelings behind the scenes, you take the next step and you move forward. That is not what happened here. And we hear all kinds of different tales of exactly what has happened. But the way it came out is that, as everybody knows now, North Carolina has a sitting duck head coach going into the final game of the year, which you do not want. You would prefer for your players to not know that their coach has been fired because of the reasons that we've just laid out. And it's not fair to 18 and 19 and 20-year-old kids to understand that, hey, I've got a full week of preparation ahead of me. I don't know what my future is going to look like because my head coach and my coaching staff has been fired. And yet that's where we are. And so it's not a monolithic type situation either, right? Because there are better players on the team than other players. And there are probably already been kids who've been reached out to. And, if they've already been reached out to and they know where they're going next, well, it's really not that big of a deal how they play this weekend. But yet, if they're not sure where they're going and they know that they're leaving, well, they're going to want to make sure they do their best. And then there's other guys who maybe have nowhere to go and they're hoping for the opportunity and they're mad that they're not getting the opportunity. So there's so many different emotional dynamics that come into play because how this all played out was not the way that it needed to play out. And that makes it difficult.
Yeah, everybody just looks at it black and white, and like you plugging in the Xbox over here and playing it on the video game. I suck at that. I couldn't imagine trying to get all the different personalities, all the different things, because not only that, you have a ton of seniors. You've got however many they announced. And then you've got a handful of those, 7 or 8 of those that can come back and have another year. You've got guys that are done forever. We talk about getting a team up to play week by week over the last few years on a normal week, on a normal game week. And now you have all this into it. Are we ready to do predictions? We didn't talk a lot about it. I think the key is, can Jacoby Criswell stay upright? And can Amarian Hampton run the football? State's ability to stop the run, I think, has been a big deal, but I don't know if any of that matters going into this one. Jason,
well, I think it matters a lot. I think we need to discuss that a little bit.
Go.
I mean, when you look at these teams, there's one team that has done one thing really well. So the first thing you do when you're trying to assess these things is you try to assess, is there one team that has a clear strength? And if so, what is it? One team has done one thing really well this season, and that's Carolina running the football. They've run the football well in all but really 2 games. And if you look at the BC game, it's not that they got stopped running the football, it's that they stopped running it. They gave 11 carries to Omarion Hampton. We talked about that in the day after of why did they, I thought they panicked. They got down just a little bit and then they went away from what they are. But on the whole, on the season, when they've turned and handed it to Omarion Hampton 25 times, they found ways to run the football. Now, if you look at the next best thing that anybody does in this game, it's NC State stopping the run. So it's a bit of strength on strength. Now, Carolina's run game has been better on the season than NC State's run defense. Because if you look at the teams that actually could run the football against other teams, and then when they played NC State, Clemson ran for a whole lot of yards on NC State. Looking at it here, Clemson ran for 33 carries for 269 yards, 8.15 per carry. Tennessee ran 44 carries. This was in game 2 for 249 yards, 5.66 per carry. Stanford ran 39 carries for 225 yards for 5.77 yards per carry. Now, they've had some success stopping the run against some of these other teams, but, Duke can't run the football. It's not that big of a deal to shut down Duke's run game to that degree. Now, they ran a little better in Carolina, but, they've been up and down with that, but they've given up some games where they've given up a ton of yards on the ground. So Carolina needs to assess those particular games and what made those teams able to do so. I think that's one of the differences with State this year is that with a couple of the guys they lost from last year, they're not quite as solid against the run as they were last year, not quite as physical against the run. And this is a game where I think, again, if nothing else, to set the tone toughness-wise, you've got to absolutely run the football. What makes it hard is their 3-3 stack approach where they're going to move around and do all of that. And if you are Carolina, your strength is basically getting up against the sled and pushing because you're so big, especially at the tackles. And having those guys try to chase guys that are a little quicker moving around, that's not a recipe for success usually. So they've got to make sure that they find a way to get those bigs on bigs and then get other players, pull when they need to do things to get, your quicker guards and your center on backers and some of the smaller players. So they'll have to scheme it a little bit, but that to me, that's where the game is really decided. If Carolina is able to run the football on offense, I think they'll score enough points to win this game. If they go out there and they rush for, what Duke did, 27 carries for 31 yards, they got no shot of winning this game. Because the only way that Jacoby Criswell is going to be kept upright by this offensive line against that approach, against the 3-3 stack that State likes to run, the only way that's going to happen is if they're running it well and he's only throwing in RPO and play action situations. Final thing is I do think State's secondary has shown some weaknesses vertically. They've gotten run by a number of times. Unfortunately for Carolina, that's been an area that they've not been able to really do much damage against teams this year, is getting over the top. So, if you can find a way to make that happen, then, there's some chances there. But to me, on that side of the ball, that's where things go. And it really does boil down to, can Carolina get a hat on a hat to give Omarion Hampton a chance against that defense to pile up enough yards for them to score? That to me is the game. And if Omarion Hampton has fewer than 20 carries, Carolina's not winning the football game. If he's got, north of 25, I think they got a real good shot of winning this game.
Looking at State's rushing, they've rushed for 250 or more in 2 of the last 4 games. Those other 2, they rushed for less than 100. And they ran nuts over Georgia Tech and still lost. Greg, any last thoughts on the actual game plan itself? I think Carolina's defense, I just don't know. This is one game I have no idea what to expect, and that's what you talked about earlier is who knows what happens, because it's a heck of a job of these coaches, these assistant coaches, to try to get them going. Does this game have any more meaning, or is it less meaningful, Greg, given the events of the last week? I know what it means for the fans, for the program.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of pride. NC State's wanting to get to a bowl game, and they want to send Mack Brown out with a loss. And conversely, Carolina is already in a bowl game, but they want to be able to send Mack out with a win. They want to give him 289. And that's a strong thing because as anybody who's paid attention to kind of message boards and sports talk radio and social media this week, I mean, this is not necessarily a decision that was kind of unanimous in terms of the fan base. There's a lot of people who really like Mack and kind of what he was doing. They weren't, their eyes weren't covered into thinking that things were better than they were, but they thought that there was hope for the future. And then, of course, there are plenty of others who thought otherwise. And so there's a lot of discussion there. And I think that's a good thing for Carolina, as you alluded to earlier, Tommy, because too many times before we've seen Carolina wait too long. And when a decision made, people are like, well, finally, like everybody's in agreement. Now, I think Jason's exactly right that North Carolina has to lean on Marion Hampton, and he has to be the engine. On the other side of the ball, I think it's important for North Carolina to limit what C.J. Bailey can do. And I really think it'll be interesting to see if he stays at NC State, because I think the kid has a bright future. He's a big-bodied kid. He can move. He may not be a true dual threat, but he's fast enough and quick enough to be able to use his feet. But he's a freshman. And it takes time to kind of adjust. And so when you look at what he's done this year, when he's been kept clean, his offensive grade's an 84.1. That's really good. He's been solid, 8.1 yards per attempt, 79% adjusted completion percentage, 11 TDs, does have the 7 picks. But as you might expect with a true freshman, when he's been put under pressure, it's a completely different ballgame. And that grade drops to a 37.4, 1 big-time throw against 7 turnover-worthy plays. So teams that have had success against NC State have been able to put him in duress. And we've talked all year, Jeff Collins, what he wants to be able to do is to create havoc. And it begins with limiting the running game, as Jason's laid out. But once you do that, then you put a opposing offense behind the chains. That's when you can get after the quarterback. And if you can do that successfully and get off the field more often than not, and you can lead on, Marion Hampton to kind of ground out some yards, and you're not having to rely on Jacoby Criswell to win the game for you, you've got to like North Carolina's chances. There's a lot of ifs in there, but I think if Carolina can get after Bailey and put him into difficult situations, they're going to be able to have success, and that should be enough to get the job done.
It's going to be interesting. Saturday, 3:30 in Kenan Stadium, North Carolina State. I know for a fact that NC State would love nothing other than to beat North Carolina in Mack Brown's last game in Kenan Stadium, as they would always love to beat Carolina. There's a book about the rivalry in basketball, the Duke rivalry. What is it called? A hate like no other, or something referring to hate. I think Carolina fans don't quite realize how bad NC State will say dislike right before Thanksgiving, North Carolina. Write your scores down as I talk about congruity, Matt at congruityhr.com. Get your small to mid-sized business assessment. They can make your business a national business, so they've done theirs. And you know, inside Carolina people get a free assessment, and free is always great. Folks in the chat, put your predictions in there. Greg, it looked like you might have had one more comment there on the hate thing. You can take it there, or you can go to your predictions.
No, what's the old nursery rhyme that we all said when we were kids?
Duke is puke, Wake is fake.
The team I hate is NC State. Yeah.
It is funny that I asked Mack about the approach on Monday, right before Evan asked him about whether he was coming back, and sort of precipitated all this stuff. I said, are you going to change your approach to the rivalry given everything that NC State does? And I more meant about not talking so glowingly of the opponent as much. And he kind of said into me, he said, if you want me to say I hate them, I'm not going to do it. I'm not a hater. But there's a valid point as to how NC State approaches it versus how North Carolina approaches it, I think. And that'll be interesting to see that whoever coaches next, because we know what in basketball is different, but Roy Williams hated NC State, and it absolutely translated to his team and to his record against that team in Raleigh. Anyway, Greg, it's just been an interesting week, man.
It has been. But no, that point's valid, Tommy, because Hansbrough, especially after they lost that first game, I'm trying to think, was that maybe his second year when they lost to State? And Hansbrough after the game was like we knew it meant something to him. Now we really know what it meant to him. And I mean, look at Roy Williams' record against NC State. It's silly how good he was against them. So there's a lot of truth in that. And that's the interesting thing is, Doran's had a lot of success. John Bunning had a winning record against NC State when State had some better teams because he played at Carolina and he understood what that rivalry was about. Butch Davis came in and had an NFL mentality of every game's the same, which is true.
But it's not.
But it's not. And that's
not true.
That's what's so great about college sports.
I'm afraid it's starting to fade though, because of the way that things are restructuring and all that. And, this is a conversation for another time, but just in brief, this is the kind of tragedy of the major shifts in college football that, if you've got guys that are in your program for 3 or 4 years and really come to identify with your school versus their school and those rivalries and all that, that's different than mercenaries who are on campus for a year or two. It's just different. You got a guy that's a 5th-year player. You mentioned Tyler Hansbrough. That guy was all North Carolina. By the time he was done, he'd been on campus and he'd been the man for 4 years. And he was surrounded by a bunch of other guys who'd been there for multiple years and they were invested. This is us versus them. The mercenary thing, it just does not have the same level of rivalry there. And I do think that saps the lifeblood a little bit of what makes college football so special.
I agree with that. I mean, listen to Jeff Schottmer on the VIP show this past week talk about what he thinks about NC State. I mean, he is not the only one. He is not the only one. And I think for the fans want everybody to think that way. And Jason, to your point, is just not that way anymore. And I think Mack sort of embodies that with everybody, let's compete and everybody hug. And, anyway. I've got my pick written down. Greg, go.
So I think the team's going to rally around Mack. Mack has done a lot of good things for North Carolina over a long period of time. And I think he really did a good job of directing the program through COVID a couple of years ago because that was very challenging. I thought he did a really good job with Tylee Kraft's passing earlier this year. He really has become that grandfather type individual. And I think because of that, the team's really going to rally. And I hope the fan base, I hope the crowd on Saturday appreciates that and gives it their all. And because of that, I think North Carolina pulls this one out. So I've got North Carolina winning this one. Should be an exciting game, as these typically are, but I've got Carolina winning 31-24.
I'll go ahead and go. I think because of several things we've talked about, I think of the unknown emotional aspect of it. Once upon a time, you win one for the Gipper. I think this is a new age. It's more, and I could be totally wrong, but you play for your next stop these days, and you would hope that translated into everybody playing the best ball they've ever played. But I've seen this movie too much, and it pains me badly to say NC State 33-20, because I don't know if Roy or me feel about NC State. I'm not going to say it on air, but Jason, you're up.
You didn't make a pick.
I did. I just can't say it. State 33, Carolina 20.
There we go. So State 33, Carolina 20 for Tommy. Yeah, and for me, I'm in the strange position of doing this show for Inside Carolina and teaching at State right now. So can't exactly hate the folks who cut you your paycheck on in that respect. So that said, I'm with Greg. I think these guys have a lot to play for here in terms of circling the wagons. I think they will rally around Mack, and I think we've got a data point for that, and that's that after Mack very nearly quit earlier in the season, what happened after that? Did that team fold?
How many games did they lose after that?
Did they?
They did not.
They did not
and there
fold.
Was a lot else.
They kept playing.
There was a lot else going on.
That's right. There was a lot else going on, and they kept playing hard. And they seem to have rallied around him there. I think they'll rally around him again. Whether that's enough in a rivalry game is a whole different thing. But I think we're going to see a team that's actually invested. I'm going to go with Carolina to win this one in a score that's really close to what you picked, Greg. And that is NC State 27, UNC 30. I think I'm gonna roll the dice with the one thing that either team has done great all season, and that's Omarion Hampton. I think Hampton goes for 150 plus, scores 2 or 3 touchdowns, and puts himself in the annals of Carolina football for the kind of highlights that he's going to put up against this NC State team, and it'll be something that people will remember is Omarion Hampton's last rivalry game and what he did. So I that's the thing I'm going to bet on here. I think they'll do enough in other areas, but I'm betting on Hampton to be the difference in this game.
It would be perfect for a Johnston County young man in Omarion Hampton to wear out NC State, given the nature of that rivalry around here. I just want to see Hampton have more carries than Jacoby Criswell has throws. I'll switch my pick if we guarantee that happens. Greg, Jason, it's been fun. I guess we'll get together before a bowl game and do a game plan, but it's hard to believe we've done 12 of these now, and these seasons fly.
Dude, I cannot wait for the Independence Bowl. It's going to be awesome. We're going to get together on Christmas Day, I think.
Greg Barnes. Man,
and I'm sure we'll be together talking coaching changes and things between now and then. So
yeah, over under emergency podcast before that, Greg. 3.
All of us said 3 at the same time. I'm for those of you who aren't listening or aren't watching. I'm holding up. I put up 3 fingers at the very moment that both of them said 3 at the same time. So we're all on board here.
The only question is, do you knock your Thanksgiving turkey fork out of your hand to do one? I think we're good there.
I think we're safe there.
We'll be back. Jason Staples, Buck Sanders, and this guy will be with you Sunday morning at 9 a.m. to talk day after. I'll be back in about 3 hours to talk Carolina-Michigan State basketball for those in the live chat. Shout out to everybody. Look, I know I have to be here. A ton of these Inside Carolina fans, they don't have to be here, and there's several names that have been absolutely in every chat. It's pretty impressive. Greg Barnes, Jason Staples. We shouted out Buck and Ben earlier and the whole Inside Carolina crew. It's been great on the Game Plan podcast. We got some right, got a lot wrong. But one thing we always did, we showed up and brought it. Johnny T-shirt and congruity. Everybody stay safe. I'll see you in a few hours. Greg and Jason, we'll see you on the next emergency.
Sounds
Peace,
good.
folks.
Hills win big tonight.
Against Michigan State? Really?
Yep. They win big.
Yep.
All right.
I'm
There it
18
is.
or more.
18 or more. Make the show tonight easy. We shall see. I will bring this up in the post game. Everybody stay safe. Happy Thanksgiving, folks.